Hi. So today I'm going to be talking about the women's suffrage movement in the United States, and the role that music played as a means to unite different groups of women under the shared goal of suffrage and of universal women's suffrage. Um, First of all, before I jump into it, I just wanted to thank you all for tuning into this podcast and for wanting to learn more about women's suffrage and about the crossover between music as a means of power and empowerment of the women fighting for women's suffrage. Um, First of all, as an anecdote, learning about women's suffrage has always been a pinnacle of my own life. My great grandmother, born in 1926, used to pass along stories to me that her mom had passed along to her about women's suffrage. And, well, of course, being born in 1926, she never had to know a world where she didn't know didn't have the right to vote. But that said, she lived in a context where it was definitely talked about, and her mom, when her mother was born, she didn't have the right to vote. And so to me, the stories that she told me always gave me this sense of, importance and how it was so necessary for women to have the right to vote. And so while she did not have to live in a world where her gender lacked the ability to vote and to participate in the government and into the laws that they had to follow, her stories are always captured me at a young age and became one of my and this topic became one of my passions. Why, I would ask, would someone not want me to vote? In my eyes, being told these stories from my great grandmother about a time when women had little agency over themselves, I was outraged. Imagine a little 10-year-old told in the most simple terms that a little less than 100 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to make my own choices. Ever since then, I've had a vested interest in protecting the rights of women, whether that means the right to an abortion, workplace protection, or adequate health care. Granted, with this story, I was only 10 years old when my great grandmother started telling me about these different events that her mom and stories that her mom told her about. And I had to have been thinking a lot more about how I was better at math than the boys in my class, and my teacher always liked me more, and didn't see how there could possibly be a world where boys were better than girls. So, granted, my context of becoming interested in this topic is slightly skewed towards perhaps not actually women's suffrage and more just me feeling like girls are better than boys. And of course, we're getting past that in this era now. But my great grandmother's stories followed me to middle school and to high school, where I always found a reason to run for class office or to enthusiastically ask my friends to vote for me and give them reasons to vote for me. One being, hey, you have the right to vote, so use it. So alongside my passion for female empowerment, and probably I could call myself a little mini feminist as a child, I always found myself drawn to music, and would make songs in the playground with my friends about almost anything that came into my mind, whether that meant the blue jays flying past us, or whether that meant the bully who the boy bully who stole my chapstick in class, who, again, why would he get the right to vote and not me? I always found music to be a very important part of my life. And so, while my great grandmother's stories neglected to mention a potential crossover between music and her suffrage anecdotes, thank you to my great great grandmother and her own stories, my recent investigation into the role of music in the movement allowed for me to think further about the intersection between music and women's suffrage much more deeply than I ever had before. I recall learning about the women's suffrage movement in fairly broad terms in high school, but the details necessary to answer my question about how music played a role in empowering women to eventually force the ratification of the 19th Amendment um, were absent. Answers to my question were absent. And so that's why I'm so excited to discuss the role that music played within the women's suffrage movement today in this podcast. And again, thank you, listeners, for tuning in, because I think this will be a very important and beneficial podcast to listen to, especially if you have little context about the role that music played within the movement. Before jumping in, I just want to give a brief overview of the main topics of today's podcast, just so you have an idea about what I'll be covering. My investigation can be broken up into a few different topics. First of all, I wanted to discuss the lyrics of the women's suffrage movement and how the lyrics specifically were used as a means of creating a successful movement. Within the lyrics, musicians and lyricists were able to use specific rhetorical devices to unite different branches of the women's suffrage movement, with some being more conservative in theme and others having much more aggressive rhetoric. Lyrics served a purpose of uniting specific supporters. In unison with the ability to unite certain subjects of people um, and subsets of people, the lyrics themselves could be repurposed as literature and consumed as any other piece of literature. So imagine a book or a children's book or just anything that can be read and processed in that way. Lyrics of songs were actually used that way in the women's suffrage movement. In addition to that, and almost in concert with that, merchandise with lines from songs and leaflets and booklets of songs were sold, indicating that lyrics of music had an economic purpose as well as the purpose of uniting women. After a conversation about specific songs, and after you get to hear a couple of examples, which I gladly found a few, and that's why I'm making this podcast today, I plan on doing a deep dive into the role that performance played within the movement, how different variations of performance worked in various ways to create a united front. Citing the difference between convention performances versus those that can be found at rallies and marches. Performance provided a platform for explicit participation and unity. Ultimately, I hope you leave this podcast today with the understanding that music served a very integral role in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, as it worked as a tool to unite the citizens of the United States and garnered public support of the bill. Without music, there would be a lack of unity within the movement, and they would have had less financial support, and it would have been much more difficult and less accessible to put movement values and ideals across into a large audience. In terms of research that I've done to make these assertions, most of my information is coming from a mix of a thesis paper by Rosalind Lee Brandis called Let Us Sing As We Go, The Role of Music in the United States Suffrage Movement, a book titled Women's Suffrage Memorabilia by Kenneth Flory, another book titled Selling Suffrage by Margaret Finnegan, a collection of primary sources consisting of different songs and lyrics compiled by Danny O. Crew, and a couple of other historically contextual books, which I'll leave in my references later. With the information from these books, I feel confident in my assertion that the women's suffrage movement would not have had the same success without the use of music and the creation of suffrage-specific music. So now that we have a bit of a baseline for where I'm going to take this podcast, I want to first jump into lyrics. And so, looking at the way in which I'm going to split up this podcast, I'm going to first look at a particular aspect of music, namely lyrics. And I'm going to use those lyrics and my analysis of the lyrics to provide a baseline for it showing you how lyrics themselves and the lyrics of the suffrage movement played a huge role in uniting a union of women who shared the same vision and the same expectations when it comes to women's suffrage. And so lyrics here were used as a uniting force as well as a form of literature. And in addition to that, it was also used as an economic commodity, as I mentioned earlier. And so first here, I just want to talk about lyrics, and later I'll go into the ways in which performance played a huge role in the movement as well. And so, first of all, I just want to talk about lyrics in three different aspects of lyrics as a form of the movement. And so, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about lyrics as literature. And so, while you might be thinking, of course, lyrics are literature, they're written words, I found it very interesting when doing my investigation to see how the lyrics themselves are different songs and that lyricists that were suffragettes created, they were used as a means of putting forward the ideals of the movement and in giving people the ability to read the ideals of the movement without actually even participating in rallies and stuff. And so oftentimes these lyrics were used as a form of a book or within the form of a leaflet or a songbook or even a paper article. And so in printing the lyrics, those members of the movement were able to create a broader outreach of people who were willing to support women's suffrage. And at this time, most American activists actually saw journalism and print and literature as a means of reaching citizens who were stuck at home, who maybe were not able to leave the household or get a job. And at this time, I mean, women were kind of secluded unless they had some sort of a group, which often meant higher socioeconomic groups had more of that socialization because they had more money and ability to join clubs and stuff. And so in a way this form of using lyrics as literature embraced the literacy of the women across the United States, and it used reading, writing, and circulation to put forward the ideals of the movement and to give people a basis for understanding where the movement was coming from. And so in this way, lyrics were used as literature and were easily digested by women across the board, and women who perhaps weren't allowed or able to leave the home, or they were stuck raising kids at home and weren't really getting a taste of the real world out, where they may encounter music in terms of audible music. And so in this way, printing lyrics was very important because it garnered more accessibility, or it gained an element of accessibility that it didn't have before, or the movement itself might not have had. And so in that way, lyrics were very important. The second section of lyrics that I really wanted to focus on today was how music itself was used as a commodity to help fund the movement. And so, in terms of a commodity, um, the lyrics themselves were often printed in leaflets or in booklets and in sheet music books to sell those and then to create a foundation um, for an understanding of the women's suffrage movement. And so, in a way, this is actually very multifaceted because music was used as a commodity to be sold. And in that commodity, they used lyrics specifically to type them on t-shirts or to use pins and to use lyrics from songs. And so while selling music as a commodity, it allowed them to produce money as well as publicity for the movement itself. And so in in creating products that used lyrics that were within music that people were familiar with and were used to listening to, this lyrics themselves are actually um, put forward in society in ways in which music as an audible experience may not have been. And so it's very interesting to read about how, about Margaret Finnegan's book about selling suffrage and about the use of commodity goods at the time, and how in reality, women's suffrage, I mean, the people funding it were either wealthier women who were able to provide money that their husbands had for them or their family had given them, or they didn't really have funds. And so it was very important to use things that were at their disposal for funds and for commercialization because at the time, women weren't really given the same roles and jobs as men at all. I mean, most women were stuck at home, and if they got out of the home, they weren't really doing jobs that would make them money. They weren't even allowed to keep money. And so, in terms of contextualization, using lyrics as a means to create funds and to fundraise for the movement was very important and a significant part of the role that music played within the women's suffrage movement. And so it's very important to note that as a commodity. And Margaret Finnegan's book does a great job of discussing um, selling suffrage is what it's called, and she does a great job of discussing just the way that commodity and purchased goods and consumerism played a role within putting forward the ideals of the movement and in ultimate suffrage. And also the book on women's suffrage memorabilia touches on this a bit too, just about how different subsections of the women's suffrage movement used lyrics as a commodity to make money and to use that money to then have more conventions and have more rallies, ultimately not perpetuating in a bad way, but keeping the movement going in a way that without funds they wouldn't be able to. And the final form of lyrics that I want to touch on a bit are lyrics as a means of uniting a common front and expressing suffrage ideals through a new form, which of course music itself was used at different conventions and rallies, and I'll touch on that later. But the music and in creating music and building a sense of community, these lyrics were able to use rhetoric such as we versus I, and really putting forward a united front in order to seem unified and to make women feel united within the cause. And so, in terms of unity, I want to next jump to the power of lyrics and how different levels of forceful rhetoric can help gain support from different political backgrounds. And so, while this conversation about lyrics and how it's used as a means of unity um, is true, it's also necessary to look at the different musical examples and to see how music itself garnered support in different ways in different areas of the movement. And so one song maybe isn't going to be what everyone wants to hear. And so more radical songs focus more, as I'll get into in a little bit, focus more on on sticking it to the man in a way, and focusing on justice and how they had been wronged, and how they deserve the right because they're inherently equal or even better than men, and why should we be be bending our knees for men? And that was kind of the rhetoric of some songs, and much more angry. And the anger there really fueled and created a sense of unity among different groups of women. Whereas on the other hand, there's some music that really emphasized the fact that women deserve the right to vote because they're mothers and they have children. And so it's a definitely different, an interesting way to look at women's suffrage, and the lyrics themselves lend themselves to this deeper analysis of the different subsections of the women's suffrage movement in general, and who these songs are for. I mean, on one hand, women who are younger, like the Alice Paul type of activists during this time, they didn't want to emphasize that we need the vote because we have babies. They wanted to say we need the vote because we it's an alienable right that has been taken from us and that we aren't allowed to have. And so I think they're definitely, the lyrics themselves shine a light onto the different varying groups and the ways in which they tried to gain support from either rich, wealthy men who perhaps would not want to support them, or to follow the rules and the rank and class kind of rules of the government, and just following the way that things were. And I think that we even see that ring true today in politics, that the more conservative people either want to go back a bit, or if they're still pushing for change, they wish to follow the preconceived notions of how change should occur, whereas some of this music was more radical and used in more radical settings. And so those settings were used to garner more support from different areas that were perhaps younger and more radical and perhaps less socioeconomically sound. And so here I just want to first go into, and I want to give you a couple examples of the music that I'm talking about. And so the first song I want to play for you, just a little bit of, is, it's kind of funny. It's called Winning the Vote, and it actually um, goes through a conversation between a woman and a man. And the man starts off talking about how, why should you have the right to vote? Like, you don't need the vote. We don't need you to have the vote. And the woman argues with him basically. And so here's a taste of that. Um,
I've been down to Madison to see the folks and sights. You'd laugh, I'm sure, to hear them talk about the women's rights. Now it's just as plain as my old hat, as plain can be, that if the women want the vote, they'll get no help from me. Not from Joe, not from Joe, if he knows it, not from Joseph, no, 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 not from Joe, not from me, I tell you, no.
Say, friend Joseph, why not we should vote as well as you? Are there no problems in this state that need our wisdom too? We must pay our taxes same as you, as citizens be true. And if some wicked thing we do, to jail we're sent by you. Yes, we are, same as you. And you know it, don't you, Joseph? Yes, you do. Yet you boast you'll not help us win the vote.
so as you can see here, I won't play any more of that. That's just two verses, I guess, but one section of that song. And that song specifically talks more, I mean, the woman is trying to convince the man why she should have the vote. And so it's very interesting to analyze that song in conjunction with the other songs, because it's more about taxation and how women should not be forced to follow these rules and be taxed if they aren't going to be able to influence them. And it's, I mean, America was founded on taxation with representation. No taxation without representation, rather, is what it was said in the beginning of American politics. And so that song was kind of playing into that narrative and convincing the man what it is. But it's very interesting to hear the style as well, because it was actually sung to a song that people already knew. I think it was called like "Oh John" or something like that. And so it was sung to a tune that people already knew, and that's very integral in this as well. And then one other song that I wanted to play for you guys is actually a more modern interpretation of a song called I'll be no submissive wife. And so this song, I think, plays into the other aspect of lyrics that I was referencing earlier before playing that song, and just how in trying to um, fight for women's rights and not play into that role that women were supposed to fill at the time of being the mother and being the wife. This song is more of a fight against that, and it's a very different narrative than the one before. And so here's a clip of that, and it's a modern jazz interpretation, which I found very interesting to hear. But also, I don't think this was how it was sung at the time, which is something to put into context. But that said, I think that it's interesting to listen to.
I'll be no submissive wife, no, not I, no, not I. I'll not be a slave for life, no, not I, no, not I. I'll be no submissive wife, no, not I, no, not I. I'll not be a slave for life, no, not I, no, not I.
So I'll just play that clip for you now because I know I mean, it's louder and it's definitely jazzier, which of course it's intended to be. But I'll be no submissive wife, no not I, no not I. I'll be no slave for life, no not I, no not I. And so those lyrics are very interesting just because they position the woman and their role as a wife and their role in society at the time as um, I mean, it almost conflates it to slavery, which again, that can be interpreted in different ways. But this song is definitely more of a protest against the current status quo and advocating for moving past the status quo. And so songs like those, as well as some others that I'll mention very briefly, show how different types of rhetoric and types of vocabulary can garner support from different areas of um, people within the United States. And so that's actually a very important distinction to be made because while yes, music was used as a uniting force, it doesn't mean they were all united under the same exact ideals. I think it's been shown very easily through this project that while yes, they all united for women's suffrage, they didn't do it in the same ways. And so a more conventional conservative woman perhaps wouldn't have wanted a song like that because they liked being wives. And so there's definitely a very different tone in terms of tone and message in terms of why women should have the vote. And so, just briefly, I also want to mention um, other types of rhetoric that I found. And so, Mary Louise Carlton had a song in 1911 called Votes for Women. I couldn't find a clip of this one, but she talks a lot about justice and right and the struggle and uses words that are much more aggressive in rhetoric and are used as a means to and unite women who believe that they should have the same role as men, and they're not fearful of losing their place with marriage or the children. And that kind of is like the marriage song. I mean, it's more about fighting what's already been established, and you can't really do that within conventions. Whereas then Charlotte Perkins Gilman's song "Another Star" from 1911 um, has that same rhetoric again about the wife or about the baby, and so it says a ballot for the lady, for the home, and for the baby. Come, vote ye for the lady, the baby, the home. And so she places an emphasis on the home and on the baby. Um, and so that it works hand in hand also with a speech that I found in one of the books that I was reading for this podcast about. It was titled just how voting is the enrichment of the mother, and so I find that structure and that the way of phrasing that and framing it very interesting because clearly Charlotte Perkins Gilman's purpose here is to bring in conventions of the family and to say that women or voting, sorry, would enhance that rather than say that voting is an integral and inalienable right of women that men have. And so it's interesting just to see how that rhetoric plays out. Um, and then for the last few minutes, I want to talk about performance of women's suffrage music and how different types of music and different types of performances, there were attempts to garner different types of public support. And so first, I'm gonna break this up into conventions, specifically conventions by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and the other section of rallies and protests that were less conventional and more a direct protest of the government. And so, first of all, the National American Women's Suffrage Association created these conventions, and they were all across the nation. And so there are accounts of them in different corners of the country as well as in the middle, but they really hit everywhere. And so the National American Women's Suffrage Association put on these conventions that were often um, much more focused on upper middle class kind of initiatives and problems. And so these conventions used music and singing as a means of uniting those present, and really emphasized the use of music within their conventions, within the meetings. And so in a letter actually from Susan B. Anthony, she wrote that and suggested that the youngest generation at the convention, so whoever's the youngest, should sing, to demonstrate that music and art, alongside women's rights, were transmitted and were important within younger generations. And so she was placing this emphasis on young women, in singing, because she noticed that using music in conjunction with these ideals, and women's rights was a very good way to show that um, it was important to younger generations as well. And so, actually, looking at the convention minutes from the 1906 meeting, for example, just as a means of this music, song leaflets were under the heading literature, and other like journals and newspapers printed the lyrics to suffrage songs in poetry columns and stuff like that. But from the convention, they used these song leaflets, and they made sure that singing was a feature that was present at every single convention, and it was very, very, very integral in uniting people at these conventions. And so these songs often also um, were much were very easily accessible, and they use contrafacts, which a contrafact is a musical composition built using the chord progression of a pre-existing song. And so oftentimes at these conventions, they used more patriotic songs that people had already known, to make it more accessible, and to also use that message of patriotism in conjunction with women's suffrage ideals. And so that kind of worked for the more conservative woman, upper middle class woman, and her own personal views. And so, this in mixing patriotism, suffrage ideals, it gave a little bit more meaning than just women's suffrage, because it said, "Hey, we're Americans. We're proud of our country, and we want to vote so that we can show that we're proud of our country through the vote." And so, it used this different kind of um, ideal and a different it's just very different from the music that you can find at, and I'll talk about in a second, at rallies and protests. And so the tradition to use music at these conventions was established in 1902, and the entire audience was expected to sing, and they used printouts of the lyrics to sing along if they didn't know the words. So that gets back to my point about lyrics as literature, because at these conventions, the lyrics of the songs literally were literature, and they were one had like labeled as literature, but at the same time, they were used and read and consumed as a means of literature. At the same time, those lyrics were then printed onto clothing and to items where people could buy them. And at these upper middle class conventions, their money was very appreciated. And so the lyrics themselves were purchased and were used in this way, in all the ways I mentioned earlier at these conventions. And it also worked as a uniting front of these upper middle class women, with the ideals more along the lines of the more conservative songs that I mentioned earlier, just um, about the mother and about the wife and about um, trying to say that we can be better wives and mothers if we have the right to vote. And so that's what these conventions really place an emphasis on. And that's more the Susan B. Anthony side of the suffrage movement. Whereas then moving along towards rallies and protests, um, aside from Susan B. Anthony and the National American Women's um, Association or Suffrage Association and those conventions, there were these rallies and protests, which were um, labeled as more spectacular and in quotes spectacular methods of of uniting and of fighting for women's rights. And so these were demonstrations that were much more public, and in a time when women weren't really expected or wanted to be as public and as vocal. And so these were much more aggressive. And unlike the music at the meetings with those conventions, this music in a parade was very loud and powerful and almost martial. Um, in a way, and it in using bands like a procession and different percussional instruments. These rallies and protests were much louder and less about singing and being peaceful and more just about making a scene. And so um, the program for the 1913 women's suffrage procession stated, "We march in a spirit of protest against the present political organization of society, from which women are excluded." And this was actually on the evening, like on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And so these rallies and protests were a real political statement that conventional conservative women did not want to do. They didn't want to cross the line in terms of political um, progress. And so they were afraid of crossing that line. Whereas Alice Paul and the people she marched alongside, they were not afraid. And so they used music that, again, could be followed easily. And um, they used contrafacts as a means of uniting people under the similar melodies that they'd known before. These parades, however, allowed women to participate publicly in dramatic events where they originally and their whole lives had been kind of conventionally barred from and banned from doing. And so this music allowed women to the music at these parades allowed women to participate in a way that their voices hadn't been heard quite so loudly before. And so these rallies and protests were for a much younger crowd and for a crowd that wanted immediate political change and didn't want to wait um, for federal, like every state to or to pass their own amendment. They wanted a federal amendment now. And so that's how the two converged, or I mean diverged, not converged, sorry. And these were much more aggressive. And so just to conclude in conclusion, because I know I'm a bit out of time for this little half-hour podcast, I just wanted to conclude with saying that all in all, music contributed to the movement in much of the same way as previous literature and stuff had contributed to it. But at the same time, it brought a new way of looking at suffrage ideals and incorporating suffrage ideals into the day-to-day life. And so, um, at the National American Women's Suffrage Association conventions or at the different parades, lyrics were specifically important because they were used as a way to unite different groups of women. Um, and the ta- and music did not accompany the movement, but in a way, it actually helped generate it and helped progress it towards its goal. Because without music, there would not have been that financial backing as well as the unification of different groups of women. And it became such an integral role of these events that they would not have been the same without music. And so I argue, in finally, that music contributed to the movement in very important ways, um, and it was able to empower different groups of women to fight harder for things they believed in. And so that's where I'll end it here. Again, thank you for listening, and I will. Um, I hope that you took something away from this, and thank you for tuning into my podcast. So, yeah, thank you so much.